There are so many structural and systemic problems that the government could go out and fix, and instead all we're getting is those things where, I'm tired of saying it, but it's a good first step. And this is a classic budget where, it's a good first step. The problem is there never is the second and third and fourth step.
Yeah.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and Treasurer Jim Chalmers has just delivered his third federal budget.
And I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Speaker. I move that the bill be now read a second time. Speaker, the number one priority of this government and this budget is helping Australians with the cost of living.
2024 budget is out and it's sending one message loud and clear. Please vote for Labor at the next election.
Jim's power gamble, a clear pre-election budget.
Make no mistake, this is a pre-election budget, giving billions of dollars in cost of living relief to households in the form of energy subsidies, rent assistance and cheaper medicine.
Every Australian household and 1 million small businesses will get money off their power bills in tonight's federal budget.
Is this a budget with something for everyone, with one eye on the Reserve Bank and the other on the election?
Lots of interest groups will be very unhappy.
2 years, mate, they've been in. 2 years now that they've been in? This is the best budget they can come up with. Oh, my God.
He's made a lot of announcements and there's lots of spending measures and cost of living measures, but on the whole, it's a little bit underwhelming. So what does the federal budget mean for you? What does the budget reveal about this government's priorities as we approach another federal election in the next 12 months? And does this budget ultimately make Australia a better place? Tonight, I'm joined by Australia Institute senior economist Matt Grudnoff, who has just emerged from the budget lockup and rushed back to our studio to answer some of these key questions about the federal budget. G'day, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
They've just let me out. 6 hours of me alone with the budget papers. Bliss.
Oh, your favourite place to be. Thanks for coming to join us. So, Matt, I just want to start with your overall impressions of this federal budget. You've been into many budget lockups. What's your overall impression of this one?
Well, firstly, it was the most leaked budget I've ever seen. Pretty much all of it came out before, which is really unusual. Secondly, it was a real scattergun approach. Usually a budget has a story that the government's trying to tell. This one seemed to be all over the shop. And thirdly, the budget seemed to have two broad goals. The first one was to offer cost of living relief, Stage 3 tax cuts, the rent assistance, Commonwealth rent assistance, energy bill relief, which we'll go into in more detail. But it also was designed to get that inflation rate, that CPI rate, back into the RBA's target band and hopefully have the RBA give the government an interest rate cut before the next election.
Okay, so if that was some of the goals, what were some of the measures in here that the government thinks will get them to that goal?
Yeah, so I mean the Stage 3 tax cuts, which we were instrumental in having the government change, which is far more evenly distributed, will hand out a big chunk of change on the 1st of July to all taxpayers. And that's probably going to be the biggest single thing that people will notice out of this budget.
The comprehensive cost of living plan in this budget delivers a tax cut for every taxpayer, provides new power bill relief for people and small businesses. It freezes the cost of medicines. It makes student loans fairer. It boosts competition in our economy so families and farmers get a fairer deal. And it supports renters as well.
But they had a number of measures which were actually designed not only to offer cost of living relief, but also reduce the CPI. And we at the Australia Institute have been championing this for well over 12 months now. The first was they've again increased Commonwealth rent assistance, this time by 10%. Last budget, it was by 15%. Not only will that help struggling renters, but it also directly lowers the CPI because it reduces the amount of money people have to pay in rent. But the big one, and the one that was probably the biggest surprise for me, was the energy bill relief. We saw that actually in the last budget, but it's been extended to all households. So previously, the energy bill relief was only to low-income households. Now it's to all households. And they think just from those two measures that the CPI will drop by a full 0.5%, which is significant, particularly when we're at 3.6% now. We're only, if you take 0.5% off, then we're almost at 3%, which is into the RBA's target band.
So it's hoping to put that downward pressure on inflation. That means the RBA could possibly cut interest rates, and that's obviously what the government wants heading into an election. Just while we're on other cost of living measures, I know the Australia Institute has been really clear in saying the government should directly intervene to help reduce the price of things where it can. There was also, I think, an announcement around the cost of medicines and the PBS. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so most of the spending on the PBS was to expand the number of medicines that are included in the PBS. So there was billions and billions of dollars for that. So if you're after a treatment that's not in the PBS, it can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Now it'll cost you at most $31.50. So that will help some people. And they're also freezing for the next 5 years the indexation of the concessional rate of medicine. So at the moment it's $7.70. In 5 years' time, it'll still be $7.70. Now that's not going to have much of an immediate effect. All it will mean is that over time it won't go up as much.
So I just want to come back to that point about your overall impression of this budget, that it had a bit of a scattergun approach, lots of different announcements, lots of which we knew about ahead of time. But we always talk about the fact that budgets are about choices. One of the choices the government has delivered here is a budget surplus.
The first back-to-back surpluses in almost 2 decades.
This year we are in a surplus.
Turning a projected $13.9 billion deficit into a $9.3 billion surplus.
About the importance of budgets being back in the black.
This is not a restrained budget. $4 of spending for every dollar of savings, Sarah. That's not restraint.
A second surplus is not an end in itself. It's an important way that we make room to help people.
That's another thing that we've been critical of in the past, more or less because a surplus is a tool. It's not necessarily, a goal in itself. Tell us a little bit about why the choice to deliver a surplus over tackling some real structural inequality that we've seen revealed in Australia is a choice that the government has made with this budget.
Yeah, absolutely. So economic growth in this budget is forecast to really slow down even more. We're getting really close to zero growth. The growth rate for this year is expected to be 1.5%, and next year it's only going to be 2%. So that's a really stagnant economy, and unemployment is expected to rise. Normally in these kind of circumstances, you'd expect the government to intervening and trying to stimulate the economy with more spending. Instead, they're running a surplus. That is, they're taxing people more than they're handing back in services. And that's a real choice. And it really is just a political choice. It doesn't make a lot of economic sense to be doing that right now, but it makes political sense in that the main two parties that we have tend to argue about who is the better economic manager, and foolishly and stupidly, they think that running a surplus is the one KPI that they have to hit in order to prove that they are, quote unquote, a good economic manager.
And if we're building on this idea that, the analysis that this was a bit of a scattergun approach from the government with no real clear ambition, one of the things we've been advocating for is an increase to the rate of job seeker, for example, to really tackle some of those structural inequalities that we've seen develop. Is that essentially the trade-off with a budget surplus, that the government has chosen not to do some of those key things that we know would really help those struggling the most?
Yeah, absolutely. They've really done nothing to lift those on job seeker out of poverty. We have the worst rate of unemployment benefits in the OECD, in the developed world, very last place on that, and nothing has changed. There's a little bit, as I said, for Commonwealth rent assistance, so unemployed people renting will qualify for that, so there's a tiny amount there, but really what they need is a boost to the rate, and we haven't seen any of that. And so rather than put in not a great amount it wouldn't cost a great amount of money to lift them out, but they've chosen instead to run a surplus and do other things.
I think it's a gaping hole at the heart of the budget. We've got a budget that's going to deliver $26 billion in tax cuts from 1 July, including $4,500 to people on the very highest incomes in the country, fix the adequacy of job seeker and youth allowance. Where is the tax reform? Where are the changes to the housing tax breaks that have been fueling the extraordinary increases in housing prices?
And equally, you could argue, I guess, that the rental assistance, while obviously needed right now to help people make ends meet and to be able to pay their rent, there isn't anything additional in here that I've heard about that would tackle or make housing cheaper or more accessible to people. Is that right?
No, my ongoing gripe about governments of both sides and housing is none of them do anything that will make housing more affordable. All they do is tinker around the edges. They talk a big game about what it's going to do, and year after year, housing becomes less affordable. And there is nothing in this budget that will arrest that trend of housing getting less affordable.
Our $22.7 billion Future Made in Australia package will help make us an indispensable part of the global net zero economy, a crucial part of a growth agenda, which is all about attracting investment in key industries, making our country a renewable energy superpower.
I want to come now to climate change and what the budget has in terms of measures there, because just a few days ahead of the budget, we saw the government deliver its future gas strategy, which is pretty much going to make climate change worse. Big investments in new gas supply, carbon capture and storage, all the kinds of things that we know are the opposite of what we need to be doing. But we've also raised a lot of attention and exposure about one of the key taxes on the gas industry, the petroleum resource rent tax. What does the budget tell us about that key tax that the government has flagged reforms to?
Yeah, so it's never been more profitable to be a gas company. Gas prices are super high. They're making huge profits. The petroleum resource rent tax is supposed to, during periods like this, rake in lots of revenue for the Australian public so that they get their fair share. The government is downgrading how much petroleum resource rent tax. It's going down, not up, at this particular time. In fact, we often highlight how many taxes actually generate more revenue than the petroleum resource rent tax. And we've got a new one because it's gone down so much. Luxury car tax collects more revenue than the petroleum resource rent tax, along with spirits, beer, cigarettes, visa charges, you name it. The petroleum resource rent tax collects less tax than all of those things. Yep.
And so just to remind people, Australia is one of the largest exporters of liquefied natural gas in the world. Australia exports around 3/4 of our gas overseas. We produce a lot of it. Times are good for gas companies, and yet they've downgraded the revenue from gas.
Look, when the oil price goes up, Norway, Saudi Arabia, places like Qatar, they're all happy, right? Because their governments rake in enormous amounts of money selling those resources. When the gas price in Australia goes up, all that happens is our gas bills go up. And, the profits from that, rather than going to the government, rather than going to workers, it actually just gets exported to foreign-owned gas companies. And we just lose out. And look, the future gas strategy is just crazy. My strategy for losing weight is to eat more junk food. My strategy for quitting smoking is to smoke more cigarettes. And this government believes that the way you reduce greenhouse gases is to burn more fossil fuels. It really is that stupid.
$5 billion spent in this budget on climate measures, $50 billion being spent on fossil fuel subsidies.
The other bit I think that is missing from the Future Made in Australia is household electrification.
Hundreds of billions of dollars for subs and defence, but climate change, which is a far greater risk to Australia and indeed the planet, doesn't get anything like the funding that it needs. Budgets are all about priorities, and they give governments a chance to really show us what they want to do more of and what they want to do less of. And unfortunately, there's plenty of fossil fuel subsidies still in this budget tonight. And indeed, the fuel tax credits, one of the biggest subsidies we have for the use of fossil fuels in Australia, is going to rise.
I guess I just wonder if there's anything else that you would like to highlight from this budget that either stood out to you as different or something that you weren't expecting to see in here.
What we've seen is a massive increase in defence spending. It's starting to flow into the budget. In fact, traditionally, the third biggest spend in the budget has always been education. Defence is about to overtake that. That is, the government, in the forward estimates, it looks like defence spending may well surpass all of the federal government spending on education. So, as we say, budgets are about priorities, and at the moment, the government is focused on defence and clearly not on education.
All right, well, sticking with education, Matt, we know students have been really doing it tough, and not only do we pull in more revenue from HECS than we do from the petroleum resource rent tax.
Which is not hard, as we've explained.
Not hard, as we've talked about, but students are doing it tough partly because of indexation arrangements. I know we kind of knew about this ahead of time, but if we stick with education, what is in this budget in terms of education?
Yeah, look, so there's the change in indexation, which is good. It's to be welcomed. It shouldn't be that students have to pay so much more, having their HECS tax increased by so much because of this indexation. But to be clear, it's like shutting the gate after the horses bolted. The reason that indexation is a problem is because HECS debts are way too large. The reason HECS debts are way too large is because the government has systematically increased the price of degrees. Now, as we say, Norway subsidises and hands out free degrees and it taxes its gas industry. In Australia, we charge students a fortune for degrees and we hand out enormous amounts of money in fossil fuel subsidies. It's all about choices. Really, if the government wants to properly tackle this problem, they should be reducing the price of degrees, not just changing the indexation.
And we're paying students in critical sectors like nursing and teaching and social work to do the practical placements, which are such an important part of their studies.
You have an aspiration of wanting young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to go into education. They've got to live on something, David. Youth allowance. This is the issue, and it should have been done.
I guess so. If we stick with that theme of budgets being about choices, perhaps this one reveals, as we talked about at the beginning, that lack of priorities. They really haven't made choices to go after and solve problems. There's just lots of announcements that will perhaps help in the short term, but don't really solve those long-term problems that the country's grappling with. Would that be an accurate kind of analysis?
That's correct. There are so many structural and systemic problems that the government could go out and fix, and instead all we're getting is those things where, I'm tired of saying it, but it's a good first step. And this is a classic budget where, it's a good first step. The problem is there never is the second and third and fourth step.
Yeah.
And if we want to solve housing, if we want to solve greenhouse gas emissions, if we want to solve poverty, if we want to improve inequality, then the government needs to actually be bold and make real changes. And let's be clear, the government could do that. We are a very low tax country. We would have to collect another $105 billion every year just to be average amongst developed countries. Not to be high, just to be average. And
when you say collecting more taxes, like, we're not necessarily saying we want to jack up everyone's income taxes. Like, there's lots of other ways for governments to collect revenue.
Petroleum resource rent tax is a classic example. Wealth taxes. There are so many areas that we don't tax properly, and resources is probably number one on that list. We're a resource-rich country that does not benefit from our resources. Foreign-owned companies and foreign-owned shareholders benefit from our resources, but Australians get very, very little benefit from it.
And that's why I commend this bill, Mr. Speaker, and this budget to the House.
All right, well, I think that's all we've got time for tonight, Matt. Thanks for coming straight from the budget lockup. How many sleeps until the next budget?
That's actually a really interesting question, because we might have an early budget next year, because the election is due in May. The last election we had was in May, and they brought the budget forward to March. If the government goes all the way to the end of the term, we might end up getting one 2-3 months early, which is very exciting.
Christmas will come early for economists.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's our budget night coverage for Follow the Money for 2024. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show this evening. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. In 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary as Australia's leading think tank. If you enjoy Follow the Money and our research, please consider becoming a regular giver from as little as $10 a month at australiainstitute.org.au. Our producer is Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.